So hello again. You know who I am, and you know who two of our speakers are, but we do have somebody new on the stage. Tulsee, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Tulsee. I lead product for the ML fairness effort at Google, and so I get to work with a number of the awesome people who are in the room in terms of thinking about how do we think about fairness for our own products, how do we develop best practices, resources, and guidance for our teams, and then share that more broadly. How do we partner with all of you to do so? And then with relation to this panel, how can we think about transparency as far as it relates to our products for our users, and then, of course, for other developers and others in the industry more broadly.
So I am not a transparency expert, which I think is a good thing for a moderator because I get to follow up with you guys on what the heck did you just say. But the first question is sort of a ground-setting question for our audience, and that is, what does transparency mean specifically for your organization or your work? Raghu?
Transparency. Like many other things, it seems to mean very different things for our stakeholders, and hence that's pretty complex for us. Let's take an example of, let's say, the virtual weighing machine that I was talking about, right?
The one where they photograph the babies?
Yeah, photograph the baby, get weight, and maybe you're actually using the weight to inform other decisions about caretaking of the baby. Now, based on the specific use case and decision you're trying to make, right, the level of transparency required is kind of different, right? Second, the transparency that's required, let's say with the WHO bodies evaluating this, probably will be very different from the level of transparency that, let's say, someone on the ground is thinking about. Someone on the ground is thinking, you know what, I don't really trust this. Let me go and take pictures of a few potatoes and see if it's actually doing this currently. Obviously, it's going to fail spectacularly. Right? So I got to kind of communicate something to them about how we are actually doing this. At the same time, put ourselves through lots of hoops, like a medical device, and get it certified. Right? And publish that information in peer-reviewed papers, and get certifications, and do clinical trials, and all that. Right? So it's there's a wide spectrum of meanings for the word transparency in our setting.
Nice.
As a legal academic and working in policy areas, there's a few different levels of transparency that I'm interested in. One of them is, you could say, individual transparency, when a measure is applied to somebody or an entity, what transparency they have over that measure. So in law, we've had laws around transparency and automated decision systems in France since 1978, in Europe since 1995. And those haven't really changed so much, and they do require that information. However, the problem with that transparency is it's quite disempowering. It's quite disempowering because individuals don't have really the time or energy or expertise to navigate with a lot of systems that by definition are, by being automated, fast-moving. So what other transparency levels do you have in law and policy? One is like an aggregate level, so allowing civil society organizations, researchers to probe systems, and these systems are maybe making smaller decisions, or they're measures, or they're shaping people's worlds.
Do you mean for things like precedent?
So here we can think of things like, for example, you might have a news recommender system.
Okay.
So you might have recommender systems, but you might also have systems that are used in government, that are used for allocating resources among different neighborhoods and so on. And these systems have an effect over time. So we see work by scholars like Oscar Gandy talking about the real impact of these cumulative decisions on groups and who has oversight and transparency over those systems. Then you have the last level, I think, which is more broadly about license to operate, where what information should you provide around the kind of context, the motivations of the deployment of AI, whether that's where the training data came from. You know, if I'm using a model on my system and it's like, well, actually, the training data here was from people who were paid much less than the minimum wage to do a labeling task, you know, there's an issue there. And so these kind of issues are also, I think, related to transparency in AI. So you've got different levels, different stages, and I think if we think of them all together, then we get a bit of a richer picture.
I think to echo what both said, I think one, transparency differs a lot based on the stakeholder, and two, there's many levels at which we want to have it. for me, I think a lot about transparency in the context of fairness, which is where a lot of my work is focused, especially in thinking about, how are these systems designed? What is the context in which they're designed? What are the mental models in which they're designed, right? And so when we're developing a system, there is some mental model under which it's developed. Maybe it's being developed for a particular region. Maybe it's being developed with a particular set of users in mind. Maybe it's being developed with a particular type of training data. And so when we develop that system, I think transparency is largely about being able to document those assumptions, those mental models, the trade-offs that were made, the objectives and the decisions that were made. And this can be transparency just at the level of a team and actually having a conversation about the assumptions that were being made, or when you're actually releasing a model for someone else to pick up and use, or even someone else to learn about, or from a policy perspective, this can be communicating more openly. But I do think, at Google more broadly, to the point about stakeholders, I think transparency can take the form of what I just mentioned, which is, assumption documentation and really thinking about the how the model was developed, where the training data came from, what the evaluation data looks like, what the objective of the model is. It can also take, how do we communicate with our users? And I think, Chris, you had given this example earlier of why this ad on Twitter, which is also something we have in Google products. And I think thinking about what are the ways that we provide transparency to users, and how do different users need different types of transparency, right? Creators on YouTube engage with the product very differently than users on YouTube do. And therefore, they need different forms of transparency. They need different types of communication. And similarly, a developer picking up a model and using it probably needs different types of information and transparency than a user who's going to be accessing it.
Nice. At the risk of doing very poor real-time synthesis, I thought I was hearing 3 categories, but now I'm even doubting that that's oversimplified. I'm hearing there's a compliance level of transparency. Are you complying with the law? Are you not doing the things you're not supposed to do? There's ethics, which is, are you behaving in an ethical way? And then there's usability, like building trust within a system. Am I missing anything from those 3 super categories?
This is negotiation. This is participatory ML, right? Where in that is really the transparency that enables a society to decide, hey, we do want this to happen or we don't want this to happen. So in the why are we seeing this ad? I would posit that many times people don't want to say, oh, I'm seeing it because you're between 25 and 35 and living in somewhere. But actually, because you're visiting a service that is ad-supported, this service works in certain ways, it collects data from these kind of things, and this is the motivations in showing this to you, and this is where limits are, and this is the oversight mechanisms, and so on. And sometimes, why is this happening to me, is a kind of more general question about what is the business model that I'm currently being faced with? How am I understanding this technological system that I'm on the other side of, and what can I do about it? Can I do anything about it? I mean, these are kind of questions sometimes, why am I seeing this is not, what is the model doing?
That sort of points at an interaction where you say, why am I seeing this ad? And the response is just capitalism. Okay. So I want to segue from you guys explaining sort of what transparency means to your org into what makes it challenging to do. And one thing that I've heard already from the panel is that the complexity of what transparency means is non-trivial. So Tulsee, do you want to begin and then we can come back this way?
Yeah, so I think to your point, I think depending on what we're talking about when we say transparency, there are new challenges there. So I'll focus for a second on model cards, which is one form of transparency, model cards and data cards, one form of transparency that we're trying to build in, right? So model cards and data cards, the idea behind them, going back to initially what I had said, was around trying to actually document assumptions. So if you're developing a model, can you actually write about where the training data came from? Can you write about who developed the model and how it's been tested and how it's been trained? And one of the larger challenges there is that scaling something like that is actually, we found it to be really hard. We can come up with questions, but everyone answers questions differently depending on their own mental model, right? So if I ask you what the limitations of a model are, you might say, maybe if it's let's say it's a face detection model, maybe it's the lighting condition, or maybe it's something else. If I ask someone else, they might say, have we thought about limitations for gender or for age or for skin tone? And so depending on where you're coming from and the way that you think about your model and your background and your experiences, you might choose to answer a question very differently. And so what you find is asking 4 people to create the same model card gives you 4 different outcomes. And potentially those outcomes might be different for different users, and different users might expect different things from a model card. And so I think one of the things that we're struggling with right now is how do we provide enough structure to actually give people who are creating model cards guidance around what we are looking for, but still encourage enough freedom and flexibility to get different nuances from different individuals.
You haven't had an opportunity to describe model cards as a process for designers. Can you take a minute just to describe for the audience what those things are and how they're used in your design process?
Yeah. So we have two pieces there, right? Model cards and data cards. And Fernanda did a little bit of an intro to them earlier, but basically both of these are meant to be frameworks and sort of question-answer processes to create documentation, but also conversation around what we're actually building. So in the case of data cards, this includes, who collected the data, where is it sourced from, who is it meant to capture? Is it meant to capture a global audience? Is it meant to capture regional audiences? How large is the data set? Who labeled the data set and what assumptions were they given or what guidelines were they given? On the model card side, we ask questions like, who developed the model? Again, similarly, what was the objective? What are the use cases? What is this not intended to be used for? And then of course also evaluation data. What metrics did you use? How did you evaluate the model? What is the actual outcome of the model's performance across various groups? And so in both cases, what we try to do is actually use this as a way to, when you're actually developing your system, start conversation around, are you asking these questions? And when you're asking them, what answers do you find and how does that change your design process? So that's kind of earlier in the process. And then now we're trying to figure out later in the process, how do we actually use these model cards as kind of long living documentation for models? So are there ways for us to have documentation that can last such that when someone else is using a model, or as transfer learning where we take one model and use it for another application or use it to train another model gets larger and larger, how can we scale that? I would say we're still at the early stages, especially because of the challenges I brought up earlier, where we're trying to figure out how do we develop model cards as a framework that is easy to use, because I think right now there's still a pretty heavy lift in having model cards as part of your design process or data cards as part of your design process. And so actually, plug there, if you would like to join our breakout session this afternoon, we're actually going to be talking specifically about that. How do we actually make model cards meaningful, but still feasible to use?
Cool. Michael?
I want to think a bit about transparency. People often think of transparency in terms of explanation, and with all the problems that explanations come across, there's one that isn't mentioned so much. There's an idea that users want simple, grappleable with explanations. It's probably true in some cases. However, a big barrier to doing this is really the input data. So when we think of can we explain a machine learning system, the common narrative you get back is, it's a neural network, it can be very hard, it's got a lot of different parts of it, a lot of different weights, it's got doing complicated patterns throughout it, it's very hard to extract them. It's not really true. Actually we have mechanisms to do that. The big barrier in practice, from what I've seen, is that the input data is data which has no human interpretable meaning. So if you are using telemetry data from websites and so on, then it's data about how long have you been on this page, when did you click to this thing, or it's network data, which is very hard to just basically summarize in a sentence of what's going on. Then you can't explain in terms of that data, because you can't explain in terms of anything, because there's nothing that a user would be able to grapple on and understand. So sometimes this data pipeline is really the challenge and the variables that are involved. And I would like to see more focus on that, because when I see an explanation system or a post-transparency system, my first thought is it robust to that kind of data set? And almost always the answer is no.
Perhaps our biggest challenge when it comes to transparency is just an absolute lack of framework and language.
You mean on the part of the users?
If we were to use the term users in an extremely broad way.
Okay.
Right? From the administrators who are running national programs and making decisions.
Yeah.
And these are the same set of people who, unfortunately, have been led on by a variety of technology vendors to put in place very siloed digital technologies. They aren't very aware, right, to begin with. So the first step is actually to work with these stakeholders to create a framework framework and language to talk about transparency in these settings, and create a layered, I hate to use the term regulatory regime, but some sort of controls, checks and balances on what do we mean by transparency in different settings and what's the burden of evidence, how do you share that, et cetera, et cetera. How do you even start having a conversation about model training? And from that perspective, I'm going away quite excited about visualizations, right? So I think there's a sort of a toolkit, a framework, and language that has to be actually first created for this sector to have a conversation around transparency and explainability, right?
Yeah.
To me, that's a hump of work that we need to get past before we look at really scaled adoption of data science and AI-based solutions.
It also seems to point, and again, I'm putting on my designer hat here, that there's an unaddressed need for education as part of the transparency, which means in order to explain to you, you need to watch this video to see what we're talking about, or to understand the law that's at the core of this thing, or, okay, so.
I'll just start. So, we are finding ourselves doing like really basic AI 101 training. This is how AI is different from computer programming or Excel sheet analysis.
Right.
That's the level at which we are having to operate. And then we are having to sit with them and look at things like, okay, now you have this data policy as it exists today, but now that AI is coming in, let's think about how this whole data policy needs to change and what new sections you need to add to this. In many places, the data policy itself doesn't exist. So we have to actually engage in creating the data policy and that framework before we talk about AI.
I was just going to say, I think it comes back down again to who are we trying to be transparent to and how are we trying to engage them in the process. And I think we probably need different frameworks and different language for each of those various stakeholders. And maybe it's the same sort of super framework of these are the rough things that we want to be able to communicate about and engage with, But I think that the format of them changes just so drastically, and so maybe that is part of the design process that we need to take together as in terms of thinking about transparency is who are the different stakeholders who are engaging with our products or our resources or our tools, and what are the most effective ways to bring that education and that transparency in.
Cool. If I can just say one quick thing. There's, in many senses, AI has been a massive disappointment. And what I mean by this is that there was a huge excitement when there was image recognition and voice recognition that was way before what we could do before, particularly around deep learning, and the idea that would then basically generalize and we would get a lot of tasks that would be similarly performant among with these new techniques. That hasn't really happened. In the end, when we see kind of smart AI-enabled systems, they're socio-technical systems. They're using AI for things it's good at, and then they're using humans and other kind of socio-technical structures to compensate. And indeed, when things work in the environment, they exist in socio-technical systems more broadly. So when we think about transparency of AI systems, what in many cases we're asking is actually transparency of a socio-technical system. If you're trying to get a car on a taxi application, then you would, it might not come, and that might be for several reasons, because the reputation system works differently in one country to another, or because there's no one around that time of day, or because they're on strike. And it's not just because of actually the optimization system that's being involved. So there is an interesting question of how do you put transparency on a socio-technical system? Because those are complex. Those are really, really complex. And unless we see some really surprising changes in the development of AI, we're not going to get any, the socio-technical systems aren't going anywhere. Well, even if we see developments in AI, they're not going anywhere, but especially.
Fun. Wow. Yes, disappointed. I'm sad now. I'm going to...
It's great for something.
We're done. We've got about 7 more minutes left. I'm going to combine... I haven't been checking Twitter. These are my notes, just so everybody knows. I'm going to combine 2 of the last questions, which were if you had to give people in the audience advice for both developing and implementing transparency policies, what would those be? Anyone want to take a stab at that one?
I think maybe just building off of the conversations that we've just been having and the challenges, I think bringing in multiple stakeholders into the room and actually, conducting user research on transparency, right? I think actually having those conversations, trying to understand what different individuals are trying to achieve with transparency, what they want to understand about the system, and actually being able to have that conversation, I think is really important. And then I think the other piece is in developing a framework or a language, any sort of framework, including model cards, I think it's really important for us to give examples, for us to create case studies, and for us to actually partner on really making rubber hit the road, very early in this process, because I think you realize very fast that a lot of the assumptions we make when we understand and think about a framework are with an example in mind, and that doesn't always translate. And so because especially machine learning comes in so many different contexts and so many different socio-technical systems and so many different processes, I think making sure that we test these frameworks early with as many different diverse sets as possible and then are willing to iterate on them quickly, I think is really important.
I'd just say if the level of transparency that you're proposing within a team is not making your higher-ups nervous at the first, then you're probably not doing it right. You should be proposing something ambitious that touches upon motivation, intent, and is uncovering stuff that maybe you wouldn't be happy disclosing initially. And okay, it'll be a ping pong and a back and forth, and you'll end up with somewhere else. But if you're proposing a kind of transparency, and everyone's like, "Good, let's do that." Maybe we could reveal and I think doing that, getting at the contentious issues, and then using some of these user studies and participatory studies to understand. Do those resonate? Do those actually what people wanted to know? And getting that dangerous area, be dangerous.
Well, a fun moment in a meeting, like you've made your presentation and your boss is like, that's good. You're like, well, I left 45 minutes to fight. Raghu, did you have advice?
Not really. I'm here to learn, quite honestly, right? But the thing that worries me, and it's more of an exhortation, is this. Even in the most technologically advanced countries, the policymakers are way behind where technology is, right? So where's the onus? Who has the onus to bridge that gap? Well, if you're really being honest, as purveyors of technology, the onus is on us, right? Which means we do have to engage in radically honest ways with the future adopters of our technology to create the policy frameworks that we need for technology to be used in a transparent and beneficial way, right, for large portions of humanity. So, yeah, my request is engage with the stakeholders that you might dismiss as technology laggards.
It's a good one. My last bit is just asking you guys for shouts out for resources for people in the audience, not just your advice, but external things. And I actually have two to contribute. One is I am on the board of a group called Policy Futures, AI Policy Futures, out of the Arizona State University. And our job is to create new fiction and articles specifically to target policymakers so that they understand AI better. So that's a cool resource. It's a really engaging way to learn about the nuances of AI. And the second one is, of course...
Let's translate that to Indian languages.
Oh, that'd be awesome. Well, we can try. And the second resource I can certainly recommend from IBM's perspective is OpenScale. It's a available tool for monitoring other AIs and providing that transparency if it's not built into the AI itself. So that's a resource you can check out, OpenScale. But other resources that you'd like to share?
I mean, I can be self-promoting and call out
I just
model
was.
cards and data cards. Model cards, there's a paper that you can find that is available externally. And we also actually have some model card examples published externally. Also, if you find me at any point today, or Mahima, who's sitting in the audience, we actually have some example model cards that we would love to get thoughts and feedback on as well. We'll be discussing them more in the breakout, but for everyone else who's here. And so those are just a couple of call-outs. I think also one thing that I think is interesting is to look at other industries and see what we can learn from the ways that they've thought about transparency. So for example, actually data cards and model cards are based off of this idea of data sheets for hardware, right? And the idea that hardware systems actually had for a long time this precedence of creating specs about their systems for users to understand what they've developed, as well as for other people to be able to build off of and learn off of. And so I think similarly, what are other places and other parts of either technology development or just other industries where we've thought about transparency and what can we learn from and bring to our own systems?
Really briefly, there's a really great recent report from the German government, the Datenethikkommission, which the Data Ethics Commission. It's got an English translation. It's about 60 pages of a summary, and it's got some really great recommendations, policy recommendations that touch upon all these areas. I don't agree with every single one of them, but they're really good food for thought, and it's by far and away, I think, the best set of recommendations in a policy report of late. And there's been a lot, as Nigel noted at the beginning. Good day.
I noticed that the transcription had a little problem with the German. Can you say it
You
again?
could just say Data Ethics Commission. That will work. That's what the Germans translated as.
Awesome.
I've got an English language website.
Fantastic. Do you have any other resources you'd like to recommend?
The resources are not actually about policy about AI, but to actually understand how the communities we deal with are beginning to deal with AI. For example, FDA put out some document on AI as medical device, right? Useful to understand the language that the medical and public health community are using to think about AI and how they are thinking about evaluating AI, which will inform how you might help figure out transparency and explainability of AI.
Fantastic. Can we have a round of applause for our panelists? Out of time.